Jesus' command to the Christian community to love one another is not a burden. And yet it comes with a variety of difficulties because love requires humility and care and submission and forgiveness and bearing one another's burdens and so much more. And the reason that this is challenging within the Christian community is that though we exist as a people forgiven and loved by God, we also remain in a world that is corrupted by sin. And so we will sin against each other. We will find each other difficult to love. We will be challenged by the differences in culture or preferences that can so easily divide us. And if we are united as the Christian community, as the local church, by Jesus and the gospel of Jesus alone, then the things that may naturally divide us in this world have the potential to destroy the Christian community. But these things also have the potential to increase our testimony to God's grace in how we love one another in spite of our differences. Which brings us to today's one another command. Show hospitality to one another. This comes from 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 7 through 9, something we've read before. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. So what does it mean to show hospitality? Maybe you think of that person who invites you into their home and they make you feel so welcome and warm and they make you comfortable and they feed you and they care for you. Now, this certainly is a form of hospitality, but it is not the heart of hospitality. Hospitality in a biblical sense is a love for strangers. A love for strangers. Now think about how this worked in the New Testament and why it became a mark of the Christian church. I mean, the core of our faith is hospitality. Jesus, the Son of God, leaves his throne in heaven and comes to this earth as a stranger. And it is those who receive him by faith that know him and love him and show him hospitality. During Jesus' life, he depended on the hospitality of people as he went from town to town and was often cared for by the generous gifts of men and women who loved him. More than that, the essence of our faith is that we are sinners against a holy God, and therefore we desperately need God to show us a form of hospitality because by our sin we have made ourselves strangers to him. We need him to show us mercy and love, welcoming us into his home where we don't belong because of our sin. And through the death and resurrection of Jesus, God has opened his home to us. He has shown us hospitality. Now think about then how this became a mark of the Christian church. The qualifications for elders, for instance, say they must be hospitable. The church as a whole was to love strangers as readily as they would love the saints that they know. If you look over at Romans chapter 12, verses 12 and 13, say, rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, and seek to show hospitality. We both care for those that we know and love, and we seek to show hospitality, a love to strangers. And it's interesting, the practice of hospitality in the New Testament even seems to connect us to heavenly messengers. Look at Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. It says, let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. I think about why hospitality was so important in early Christianity, where national, cultural, and racial, and especially religious divides left foreigners destitute. The resources may not have been there for food and housing that we often find in our own day. And so the Christian community was essential in each and every town to show love to these strangers, to feed them, to clothe them, to house them, to also then extend to them the grace of God and the gospel of Jesus Christ. But how then do we, as 21st century Christians, show hospitality? How do we show this same sort of love for strangers? I mean, oftentimes maybe we think that we don't know many strangers. Aren't there so many good programs for those that are foreigners? Maybe we're not even exposed to the people who have practical needs of food and housing. But does that really excuse us from the biblical command and its blessings? As a matter of fact, the command to show hospitality isn't even that different from what it was in the first century. We too must show a genuine love to strangers. How do we do this? First, we must seek out those who are foreign. The church should be on the front line of helping refugees and immigrants and the homeless and the needy. We can show hospitality to these people by helping them to settle into our communities and friends. There are a plethora of good organizations that you can volunteer with. Secondly, when we gather as a church, we must ensure that no one is treated as a stranger. We should welcome people. We don't recognize the cultural or political or racial divides that are so common in our world. Rather, we demonstrate our unity in Christ by welcoming anyone who would come to worship Him in spirit and in truth. And we invite the foreigners into our worship gatherings that we might then speak the truth of the gospel of Jesus to them. And finally, we show love to people who are strangers to our daily lives. This gets back to that sweet person who's so welcoming in their home. We must, as Christians, recognize that our daily lives are oftentimes quite divided from one another. And therefore, we ought to treat people not as strangers, but as brothers and sisters in the regular outgoing of our daily lives. This includes inviting people into your home, or into your hobbies, or into your difficulties, and into your joys. The Christian community should share far more than a couple of hours on Sunday morning. And brothers and sisters, these things are not to be a burden to us, but a joy. I mean, God welcomed you while you were a stranger to Him. Therefore, we must show hospitality to one another without grumbling.